Well, good evening, everybody. I want to thank you all for taking some time out of this beautiful spring-like day here in Philadelphia. I really appreciate it. I have to tell you, walking over from Philosophical Hall to here, I was tempted to just keep walking and enjoying the weather. But I also got to spend an incredible afternoon yesterday with our speaker, Nicholas Cronk, and I knew the treat that we're in for tonight, so that drew me into Franklin Hall to come and not play hooky. So this is part of the Society's 250th anniversary of 1776. The Society has always been an international organization. We have over 100 elected members from around the globe. We have an exchange with other learned societies around the globe, and we've always been a facilitator of the exchange of ideas across borders and boundaries, because we believe that the promotion of knowledge shouldn't be bound by just the borders of a nation. And so last month we had the head of the Society of Antiquaries with us, and today we have Nicholas Cronk from the Voltaire Foundation that we're going to learn a lot more, a bit about, I'm sure, in his talk. And then we're going to host the representative from the British Academy in London, Linda Cawley, and that's going to be in May. And Linda is talking about Edward Gibbon, who in 1776 published the seminal book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, so also marking its 250th anniversary. So I hope you all will join me on that day, and I hope that day is also spring-like, but you all will still find the time to come and join us. So part of the inspiration behind this international collaboration is something that's locked away in our archives. As many of you know, the Society holds over 80% of Benjamin Franklin's correspondence in our vault. And one of the documents in that vault I find personally inspiring in general, but particularly inspiring for the moment we're in. 1776 marks the Declaration of Independence. It marks the creation of our nation, but it also marked a civil war, a division within the British Empire. And that created a great friction between individuals, between institutions that had once been friends or even family were divided. And so, as you may know, the American Philosophical Society was inspired by the Royal Society in London. We had a great exchange with the British. That was the Americans primarily exchanged ideas with their British brethren across the Atlantic Ocean. But 1776 was a division, except in one case, in the exchange of ideas and in science. And in 1779, Benjamin Franklin, when he was an ambassador in France, issued a proclamation to all the merchant marine and navy ships in the Atlantic Ocean, telling them that Captain James Cook, on his circumnavigation of the globe, may be returning to European waters. And as you may also know, James Cook embarked on this expedition in July of 1776. And so in 1779, there was an expectation that he'd be returning, and Franklin wanted to make sure that all of the incredible discoveries that Cook had made would not be destroyed because of the violence and warfare that was then throughout the Atlantic Ocean. So this is what he wrote to all American captains. You would not consider James Cook as an enemy, nor suffer any plunder to be made of the effects contained in his ships, nor obstruct his immediate return to England by detaining him or sending his ships into any other part of Europe or America, but that you would treat the said Captain Cook and his people with all civility and kindness, affording them as common friends to mankind all the assistance in your power which they may happen to stand in need of. And it's in that spirit that we want to have these exchanges, and it's in that spirit that we've invited Professor Cronk to join us tonight. Professor Cronk is the Professor of European Enlightenment Studies and the Director of the Voltaire Foundation at Oxford University. The Voltaire Foundation is a department of the University of Oxford that specializes in research in the 18th century. And one of the core projects of the foundation has been the preparation of the first ever scholarly edition in French of all of Voltaire's writings. This mammoth undertaking started in 1968, so it's almost 60 years old. You're coming up on your own anniversary. And it was brought to completion under Professor Clark's leadership in 2022 in a set of 205 volumes. It's incredible. You know, the Franklin papers, I forget how many volumes we're at, but it's a fraction of that. Nicholas was the general editor of the complete works of Voltaire. And he is a historian and former trustee of the University of Oxford Press. This is what leading scholar and APS member Robert Darnton said of his work. The complete sets of Voltaire is a great trek, the greatest ever in the history of scholarly publishing. So an incredible accomplishment. And in recognition of his accomplishments, Professor Cronk was elected to the American Philosophical Society in last year, 2025. And it's wonderful now to welcome him to the Philosophical Society. Professor Cronk?
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for that generous introduction. I want to thank Patrick Spiro and all his colleagues in the American Philosophical Society for this invitation. And they're very, very warm welcome. It's a special honor to be speaking to you. A little bit closer? How's that? Is that better? Is that better? Perfect. It's a huge honor to be speaking to you this evening, and it's a special honor to be, as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, to be speaking to you in a room which is so close to Independence Hall. These anniversaries matter. You're going to celebrate the other anniversaries of Gibbon and Adam Smith, I think. These anniversaries are an opportunity to reflect on our Enlightenment inheritance and to wonder really why they matter, how they matter, in what sense, what is there actually left that we are celebrating. The Declaration, adopted on the 4th of July, 1776, famously set out the foundational principles of human rights: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration, of course, was familiar with Voltaire. He'd never met him. He went to Paris 6 years after Voltaire died, but he owned the complete set of Voltaire's writings, or what they thought was complete at the time, and he also owned a bust of Voltaire. Just need to, there we go. And this is the Udon bust of Voltaire that he bought, I think, when he was in France. And if you've been to Monticello, you'll remember that the bust of Voltaire, that's the entrance hall, and the bust of Voltaire is there on the right-hand side as you enter the hall of Monticello. So to own the complete works, to own the bust, seems like a pretty robust declaration of faith, though what Jefferson privately thought about Voltaire was a bit hard to know. He also owned a ceramic inkwell. And the fact that Jefferson repeatedly poked his pen in Voltaire's face is something that slightly worries me, and it perhaps suggests that they had something of a conflicted relationship. In any case, Voltaire certainly shared Voltaire's views about the importance of human freedom. When Jefferson was in Paris in 1785, he wrote a letter back to his friend Charles Bellini, and he wrote this: "I find the general fate of humanity here," that means France, "most deplorable. The truth of Voltaire's observation offers itself perpetually, that every man here must be either the hammer or the anvil." Well, it's a very strong form of words. And that same metaphor of the hammer and the anvil is used by many people, but for example, by Martin Luther King when he wants to drive home the opposition between the oppressor and the oppressed. So, for example, there's a very famous sermon that Luther King gave in 1954. "Instead of making history, we are made by history. The philosopher Nietzsche once said that every man is a hammer or an anvil. That is to say, every man either molds society or is molded by society. Who can doubt that most men today are anvils, continue being molded by the patterns of the majority?" This is a very important image, by the way, for Luther King. It comes up in more than one sermon, but I've quoted one of the early famous cases. And Luther King is right. The quotation is found in Nietzsche. It's in Also sprach Zarathustra. But Jefferson was right. It's Voltaire, as far as I can work out, who first coins the phrase. And he coins the phrase in his portable philosophical dictionary, the Dictionnaire philosophique portatif, published in 1764, in an article on tyranny. And this is what Voltaire writes: "J'ai peur que dans ce monde, on ne soit réduit à être enclume ou marteau." you've got the translation there, heureux qui échappe à cette alternative. It's very strong writing. And it's good to know that actually Martin Luther King quoted Voltaire in his sermons, even if perhaps he didn't know it. The inheritance of the Enlightenment works in very mysterious ways, and sometimes the Enlightenment is with us even when we don't know it. The question of how we think about Enlightenment values in our modern world is extremely complex. Of course, when a handful of 18th century white European men say that their ideas have universal validity, we get a bit suspicious. On the other hand, if we were to conclude that stirring words about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, first pronounced in 1776, have no resonance at all today, that would seem eccentric. So the challenge for us is to chart a middle course, to try to understand how the words of the Enlighteners can be understood in their original context, and then to think how in the different political and cultural contexts of our own day, the words are still meaningful to us. So I'd like to take one particular example of this huge problem, and that is to look at the discussion of Voltaire and how he discusses slavery, and then link back to his links with the Founding Fathers. The question of Voltaire and enslavement poses a huge problem. I don't mean that Voltaire's opinions are difficult or hard to understand. In fact, Voltaire writes with extreme clarity. But to say that Voltaire gets a bad press on this subject is an understatement. Some modern commentators regret that Voltaire was not more radical. They wish he was more modern in his approach. Others go further and will condemn the whole Enlightenment project as just some sort of illiberal sham. So there's the challenge. How can Voltaire's writings on enslavement still engage us? So I should say something here about my own approach. It's emphatically not my intention to defend Voltaire, as if Voltaire needs defending, and least of all by me. I'm not speaking as his apologist, but I am trying to understand what he wrote in the broader context of his times. His characteristic method is not to write one single treatise on a topic like liberty, but to continue revisit subjects that interest him in different short texts, in different literary forms. His literary life stretches over 6 decades, so there's a lot of writing. Given this way of working, it's especially important to avoid the temptation to take single passages out of context. And that's a tendency which, of course, is more common now that we have the increasing availability of digital resources that give us large access to data, but sometimes in a somewhat uncurated form. Of all Voltaire's pronouncements on enslavement, the most discussed and the most famous is the scene in chapter 19 of Candide, when Candide and Cacambo they're in Central America, and they encounter an enslaved man who has escaped from his Dutch master. There's a huge amount that could be said about this scene. It's written in an immensely complex way. I'll just make one simple point, that in this rather remarkable paragraph in the novel, Voltaire gives the enslaved man a voice. It's a suspiciously articulate voice, it's really Voltaire's voice, but still he gives the enslaved man a voice. This is a very powerful novelistic device, and it makes a direct appeal to the reader's feelings and generates pity for the man who is subject to this blatant cruelty. The scene has since acquired iconic importance on account of this engraving, which was done by an important engraver, Moreau-le-Jeune, and was added to the novel, but after Voltaire's death in 1787, 30 years after the novel was first published. But this is an engraving that is very well known in France. It appears in every school edition of Candide. It's come to represent, often if there is one illustration to a modern edition, it will be this illustration. So this illustration, created after Voltaire's death, has come very powerfully to focus our thinking about the novel. The mutilated man is a victim of the Dutch master's cruelty, and his words are quoted, as you can see here, at the foot of the engraving. C'est à ce prix que vous mangez du sucre en Europe. This is the price of the sugar you eat in Europe. Now, it's a very telling example of how Voltaire works. The initial inspiration for the scene, even the phrasing, comes from Helvetius, who wrote a book the year before called De l'Esprit, where he says something very similar about enslavement being coming at the price of sugar and European luxury. The problem is no one much remembers Helvetius de l'Esprit unless you're a real university sort of specialist, but but many readers remember this book and this phrase. Voltaire has this technique of honing in on a telling detail, and he sums up the polemical charge in a well-turned phrase that's very memorable. C'est à ce prix que vous mangez du sucre en Europe is a phrase that it just has become almost a catchphrase that resonated across Europe. The historian David Bryan Davis writes, and I quote, "By the 1770s, the idea that sugar, a symbol of European luxury, was stained with blood and tears of slaves had become a commonplace in French and British literature." Well, that's true, but he could have added that this idea became a commonplace in very large part because the literate classes in France and Britain had all read Candide. It was Candide who put this into the mainstream consciousness. So you might think that all this amounts to a pretty robust condemnation of slavery and of the role that slavery plays in the European economic system. And it's important to see that Voltaire does understand that. He doesn't merely feel pity for the enslaved man, he also understands that what he does is integral to a complicated economic structure that supports luxury in Europe. And yet, commentators today continue to single out Voltaire for criticism. And broadly, they do this on two grounds. Firstly, while Voltaire expresses sympathy for the plight of enslaved people and the cruelty they suffer, he doesn't quite go so far as to propose abolitionism. Well, that's true, but those limitations are the limitations of his time. Voltaire's writing in the late 1750s, and the abolitionist cause in France doesn't begin to gain traction until the 1770s, right at the very end of Voltaire's life. The Moreau engraving that you have here from 1787 certainly adds an abolitionist force to the novel, which it didn't have when it was first published in 1759. Secondly, and more importantly, like David Hume, Voltaire defends polygenesis, and he holds views about race which, certainly out of their context, we today find objectionable. There's no way around that. Voltaire has views about race. That's not to say he's a racist, but he has a racist, but he has views about race which are simply not ours, as does David Hume. It's also true Voltaire holds strong opinions about equality and freedom, and those opinions aren't entirely consistent with his thinking about race. This is simply an area where Voltaire's views are muddled. But that doesn't make him an apologist for slavery, quite the opposite. He clearly is not. But the real peculiarity of this debate, and what makes it so complicated to discuss, is not that it's just the opinions of Voltaire that are attacked, but also his person. No other Enlightenment philosopher has been quite such a polarizing figure in the slavery debate. The fact that Voltaire is singled out as a target is an inverted compliment in a way. It's a consequence of his celebrity. For example, Voltaire is commonly accused of having profited from the slave trade. Well, that's not entirely wrong. Like any bourgeois of the period, he owned investments, and if you owned investments, those investment houses partly invested in the slave trade. So you could say his involvement was, in a sense, passive, but that was true for every single middle-class person in Ancien Regime France who invested. But the criticism of Voltaire's involvement with chattel slavery goes much further. In particular, he's regularly accused of having invested directly in a slave ship that set sail from Nantes. The evidence for this is a letter in which Voltaire gloats, really unpleasantly, about the profits he's made from the slave trade. This letter is first cited in print in 1840 and is utterly repellent. It's also quite clearly a fake. The emergence of this alleged letter dates from the years just prior to 1848, when there was a vote in the French Assembly to abolish slavery in the French territories. As you remember, slavery was abolished during the Revolution, it was brought back by Napoleon, and it was abolished for a second time in 1848 under the July Monarchy. The letter was clearly forged with polemical intent. Charles Levasseur, who was a senator and a fervent opponent of abolitionism, cites the letter in print, proving that Voltaire is a hypocrite who pretends to condemn slavery in Candide while actually profiting from it. Well, in 1848, the vote to abolish slavery for the second time in the colonies, in the French colonies, was carried, but the forged letter continued its career, and it continued to be used throughout the 19th century in the context of the French Catholic Church's attack on the Enlightenment. So once you set up a forgery, it then acquires a life of its own. No one has ever argued that this letter was genuine. No manuscript exists, And yet the criticism that Voltaire profited from the slave trade continues to be made. Anyone who's travelled in France knows the famous Michelin Green Guides, a sort of pillar of French bourgeois culture. So I thought we should look at the Michelin Green Guide for Southern Brittany in the latest edition. Here it is. I bought it specially to quote the latest version. So we learn, Nantes, is in the 18th century France's principal slave trading port. And this is what the guide tells you. The philosophe inveigh against this inhuman trade. But Voltaire, known for his keen business sense, you can see the ambiguity of that phrase, invested 5,000 livres in a slave ship from Nantes, exclamation mark. So here is the latest version of the Green Guide, repeating something that was a polemical and disgusting forgery from the 1840s. So these forgeries have a long life. And I've actually checked in the Bibliothèque Nationale, I've looked at all the Green Guides since the 1950s, and it's been repeated from one guide to the next. What began life as a forged letter under the July monarchy becomes, in the Fifth Republic, a platitude in a tourist guide. So, as I said at the start, the Enlightenment heritage is complicated. But if we wanted to think differently about Voltaire and slavery, I think it's interesting to look at a parallel question, which is that of serfdom. So serfdom arose in Europe at the time of the decline of the Roman Empire, and it continues to exist across Europe and in other continents in a whole range of different forms all through the early modern period. By the second half of the 18th century, serfdom was coming to be widely contested in Europe, and the institution seemed suddenly to be losing its moral and intellectual legitimacy. For Adam Smith, serfdom was economically wasteful, always The Economist. For Kant, it was an affront to natural law. Herder comments on the serfdom in Livonia, that's in the Baltic states, in the 1760s, which he says is an abuse of liberty and a remnant of feudal oppression. So there's widespread comment in Europe about the moral affront of serfdom. Voltaire also writes about it as a European phenomenon. He writes an extraordinarily important universal history, the Essai sur les mœurs, and he writes a new chapter in 1761 which concludes the book, which has a section de la servitude, on servitude. So this is something that Voltaire picks up from the zeitgeist of the second half of the 18th century. This becomes a major preoccupation in Voltaire's later years. He lived at Ferney, which is on French soil near Geneva, just under the Alps. And on the other side of the Alps, still in France, was a small town in the Franche-Comté called Saint-Claude. And he learns that in Saint-Claude there are serfs working on the land. And they live under a regime known under French law as main morte, or mortmain. This means that they owe extensive rights to their lord, the landowner. And although technically they could own their property, they couldn't dispose of it, nor could they pass it on to their children except in very particular circumstances. So this is an archaic leftover from the Middle Ages, a legal relic. But far from softening over time, what's rather strange is that the rules of mortmain became more rigid in parts of France in the latter half of the Ancien regime. Voltaire was scandalized by the survival in modern France of this relic of feudalism, also surviving almost on his doorstep. And to cap it all, the owners of these serfs were monks. They were monks of the Abbey of Saint-Claude. Now this, of course, is a gift of Voltaire. He can combine defense of the liberty of the peasants with an attack on the Catholic Church, so he doesn't hold back. From around 1764, he takes up the cause. He's then a man in his 70, and he befriends a young lawyer in Saint-Claude called Christin, who many years later will be elected to the National Assembly in the Revolution. And he works with Christin to gather documentation, legal documents about the main mortable. And in 1770, he begins a whole new phase of activism. He's then in his late 70s. And that's just to give you an example. I wish I had the time. I would like to talk about each one of these books, but I promise you I won't. But this is what Voltaire writes. This is a man in his late 70s and early 80s, writes something like 12 different works, all dealing with the position of the serfs in Saint-Claude. I'll simply say that there is no real study of this. No one has ever really looked at it. And until we published the complete works of Voltaire in Oxford, it wasn't even easy to find the texts. But Voltaire has understood from other crusades that you need to influence the capital and public opinion. He produces this stream of works addressed to the king, to ministers, to judges, to absolutely anyone who would listen. And he uses a whole range of different forms. There's sarcasm, there's irony, there's legal pedantry. In a whole range of literary forms, he hammers home the injustice of the treatment of these serfs in the Franche-Comté. In 1776, the debate takes a whole new turn when a book is published called Les Inconvénients des droits féodaux, the disadvantages of feudal rights. And the book, rather, was immediately condemned by the Paris Parlement. The book was anonymous, and immediately everyone in Paris knew it was by someone called Voltaire. Now, Voltaire was a civil servant who worked for the Minister of Finances, Turgot. And simply put, Voltaire argues that wealth depends on freedom of trade and on a free people, and he's clearly acting as the spokesman for Turgot, who was bringing in a whole package of financial reforms. So I mentioned earlier that Jefferson owned the Houdon bust of Voltaire. Well, he also owned the Houdon bust of Turgot. So Turgot's financial reform was someone that Jefferson took very seriously. And if you go back to that entrance hall in Monticello, the entrance is there. On the right, that's Voltaire, and on the left, that's Turgot. So it's Voltaire and Turgot who guard the entrance to Monticello. Voltaire we can understand. Turgot is the one who's less thought about, but actually, perhaps in Jefferson's view, equally important. Speaking for Turgot, Voltaire makes a very simple point. Any form of servitude is inimical to the modern notion of enlightenment. And he says it's bad for the economy. I think we've got time to read this. The enslavement of human beings brought with it a regime of ignorance. It banished the arts. It made nature savage. It plunged France into a state of chaos from which it only began to emerge at the time of emancipations. The emancipations created towns, citizens, the arts, literature, good laws, and soon free and Frenchmen, well, that's français, so the pun works in French, became synonyms. Well, there's a lot one could say about that, but I think the key thing to say here is this very stirring defense of human liberty, the attack on enslavement and serfdom, connecting it with the arts and culture as well as with the economy. This is all straight out of Turgot. But why is he saying it in 1776? He's saying it because Voltaire had launched the campaign against the serfs in Saint-Claude. This is produced by Voltaire. It's a good example of how Voltaire works in the political sphere. He sets in motion debates that then get the influences in the French capital talking to each other. What began as a narrow argument about moral evil of serfdom grows into a broader Enlightenment argument. The flourishing of European culture and of the economy is based on freedom. Serfdom and slavery are damaging to our civilization. It's a very strong point. Now, the corpus of Voltaire's works dealing with the serfs of Saint-Claude it's an amazing phenomenon. But what I want to suggest more broadly is that the question of serfdom in Europe, the condition of agricultural workers who were tied to the land and who didn't enjoy basic human rights or own the fruits of their labor, was a major topic of discussion among Enlightenment thinkers. It's not just Voltaire. Now, in modern accounts of the Enlightenment, we don't normally talk, historians of ideas don't generally discuss serfdom. We discuss other issues, but serfdom is not seen as a major issue. But if you go back to the writers of the time, it's a huge issue. Now, I can just quote a few authors at random, but the Abbé Raynal, for example, who wrote a very important Histoire philosophique in 1770, famous for his critique of slavery, always quoted for his critique of slavery, also is equally damning about the question of serfdom. Today we quote what he writes about slavery, we never quote what he writes about serfs. Raynal was hugely important in Europe. He was widely read outside France, for example, by Alexander Radishev in Russia, where the question of serfdom was also much in debate under the reign of Catherine. Another example is Gaetano Filangieri, who was a Neapolitan lawyer, a hugely important thinker, who wrote a book called La Scienza della Legislazione, published in Naples in 1780, which has hugely indignant passages about slavery. So here's Filangieri, this Neapolitan Enlightenment thinker. What shall be said of Denmark, of Poland, of a great part of Germany and Russia, where philosophy, which has enlightened the rest of Europe and established the rights of humanity, has not yet been able to abolish serfdom? Who would believe it? This kind of slavery still exists in some countries that for more than 10 centuries have boasted their freedom and have fought for it. So from Paris to St. Petersburg to Naples, there are writers in the second half of the 18th century talking about the moral evil of serfdom. And I think it's interesting to put the Enlightenment debates about serfdom and chattel slavery side by side. Now, of course, serfdom is emphatically not to be equated with slavery. They're two different things. For one thing, the nature of the Atlantic slave trade is morally repugnant in a way that serfdom, I suppose, isn't. For another, serfs lived, at least in theory, within a legal system, and they had rights, in theory, whereas slaves, despite the French Code Noir, were effectively outlaws who lived outside any legal system. Those are important differences. But even so, there are huge parallels between the two economic systems. They're both forms of enslavement. They both deprive human beings of basic rights to human liberty. Both systems, serfdom and enslavement, were crucial to the economic structure of the Ancien regime. And of course, that's why they were hard to reform. You could have a moral position about cruelty, but to propose something that would damage the wealth and the economic stability of a country was always complicated. So many of the writers I've already mentioned, Voltaire, Raynal, Filangieri, they discuss serfdom and slavery in parallel. And they discuss them side by side, which is something that we no longer do. And I think that's interesting as a context. And the connection between serfdom and slavery is also very clear to the men and women of the French Revolution. So Voltaire dies in 1778, and in the Revolution, of course, begins in 1789, and is looking for intellectual antecedents. And they create the Panthéon, so a Catholic church that is turned into a lay temple of the great men of France, and it was men at that time. And the first writer to be sort of reburied in the Panthéon is, of course, Voltaire in 1791, and it's one of the move of Voltaire's body to the Panthéon in 1791 is one of the great ceremonies of the French Revolution. So, so here's the coffin that was produced for the Panthéon, and you can still see it if you visit the Panthéon. And the words are very interesting. So he fought atheists and fanatics, he inspired toleration, and then the last sentence is what interests me here. Il réclama les droits de l'homme contre la servitude, la féodalité. He demanded the rights of man against feudal servitude. It doesn't say enslavement, but of course it is interesting that the revolutionists remembered Voltaire for what he'd done to bring to an end feudalism and servitude in the context of human rights. So that was the view of Voltaire in 1791 in the Revolution. It's not quite the way we think about Voltaire now. Now, of course, it's obvious that Voltaire's writings just on slavery still resonate with us. I mentioned earlier the engraving by Moreau le Jeune. In 1929, Rockwell Kent illustrated a wonderful edition of Candide. It's a great bibliophile treasure. He illustrated Candide for Random House. And the illustrations are, of course, fantastic. One is obscene and was kept out from the final book, but there's a copy of it in the New York Public Library. But the illustration of the slave is interesting because I think if you look at it, although it's a very different style from Moreau le Jeune, I think he knew that. I think he knew Moreau le Jeune's engraving when he made that drawing. It's hard to think that in 1929, when that illustration was produced for Random House, it's not in some way a commentary on the question of slavery in the United States. I mean, obviously, this speaks to us in different periods. But I think we can also think about the broader context in which Voltaire was working. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that if chattel slavery is today our primary focus, for very obvious reasons, the 18th century, in some respects, has a broader understanding of enslavement as existing in lots of different forms across the continent, in different continents. So everything rather depends on your vantage point. The German historian Jürgen Osterhammel has a rather unexpected perspective. I quote, "It is still remarkable that by the mid-18th century, almost the only part of the world where slavery was not the fate of a considerable proportion of the population was Western Europe. He turns it round. Most of the world was enslaved. Not to be enslaved was the exception. And even in Europe, serfdom is widespread. Now, this doesn't, of course, diminish the particular horrors of chattel slavery, which is our modern focus. But it does show that the Enlightenment has a different focus, which is a preoccupation with freedom and the rights of man. If we look to Voltaire for a definitive modern critique of chattel slavery, we don't quite get what we want him to write. But if we look at Voltaire in the terms of his own time, and we look at how he writes about human freedom, and including human serfdom, what Voltaire writes is extraordinary, and in many respects is pioneering. He's the most outspoken of all the philosophes on this question of serfdom. His concern with human liberty is absolutely passionate, and it's absolute constant obsession. So I come back to that quotation that was used by Jefferson. In some ways, the more I look at Voltaire's political writings, the more I think that this is the key element in his political credo. So it's no surprise that the comment was later seized on by Nietzsche and then by Martin Luther King. It's in his vehement insistence on human liberty that Voltaire, I think, has left his mark on the Founding Fathers and on the Declaration of Independence. Voltaire was perhaps the first celebrity writer whose fame stretched across Europe, whose works were translated in his lifetime into so many European languages, whose plays were performed absolutely from one end of Europe to the other. And by the end of his life, by the 1770s, Voltaire's fame is also enormous in America. One of his tragedies, Zaire, was performed in English across North America, and one book in particular seems to have appealed to the American readership. And this is his commentary on Beccaria's Essay on Crimes and Punishments. So Beccaria, an Italian, a Milanese legal reformer, published De Deliti e delle Pene on Crimes and Punishments in 1764. It was a huge success and it's thought of now as a major contribution to the Enlightenment debate about legal reform. It immediately went into French translation, 1765, and it had such a huge success, I think Voltaire was probably a bit jealous. Voltaire immediately published in 1766 a commentary on Beccaria, which is a way of making sure he kept his voice in the debate. It's not a commentary, it's an extension, an evolution of the debate. Subsequently, Beccaria's book and Voltaire's book were published together in French and then translated into English, and it becomes one of the major texts attacking medieval legal structures and proposing widespread reform of the legal system. It had an enormous influence on the development of criminal law from the 18th century. What's interesting is that this is, of all Voltaire's works, it seems to be the one that's most often, I think, read and certainly most often printed in America. The first edition of the English translation, so here it is, an essay on crimes and punishments by the Marquis Beccaria with a commentary on Monsieur de Voltaire. It was first published in Charleston in 1777, and then a second edition the following year, 1778, the year of Voltaire's death. It's published in this city, Philadelphia. And the third edition is published in Philadelphia in 1793. This must make it, so here is Voltaire being reprinted at the time of his death. And the work seems to have been especially influential among American thinkers like Thomas Jefferson, who wanted to use Beccaria and Voltaire to reform the system of criminal law that effectively the Americans had inherited from England. So the old world of Ancien Regime Europe and the new world of life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice, happiness, come together right at the end of Voltaire's life in the person of the founder of the American Philosophical Society, Ben Franklin. And of course, I had to finish by talking about Franklin. Franklin was 12 years younger than Voltaire, but in other respects, they have a huge amount in common. They both are passionate about politics, and they're both passionate about printing. They're both people who understand the power of print to communicate. In 1778, when Voltaire's life was drawing to a close, he left his home at Ferney and travelled to Paris. He almost certainly knew he was dying, and he planned a sort of grand exit on the Paris stage. He went to the Academy, he went to the Comédie Française. The king refused to meet him. That added to his popularity, and he died. It was a very carefully staged exit. He meets Franklin for the first time at the Academy of Sciences, And everything is very well recorded on April the 29th, just a few weeks before he died. So at this, the Academy used to meet in the evening, and the academicians came together, and there was, for this extraordinary evening, there was Franklin, who was, of course, had a diplomatic posting in Paris, and there was Voltaire. And the members thought that the two great men, both in their own way legends, ought to sort of talk to each other or meet. So there was a sort of a clamour that they should be introduced. Luckily for us, John Adams, the future president, of course, of the United States, was present, and he's left us an account of what happened. And it is rather waspish, but I think that might have been Adams's style. I quote John Adams: "Neither of our philosophers seemed to divine what was wished or expected. They, however, took each other by the hand. But this was not enough. The clamour continued until the explanation came out, il faut s'embrasser à la française, you should embrace in the French style. So the two aged actors upon this great theatre of philosophy and frivolity then embraced each other by hugging one another in their arms and kissing each other's cheeks, and then the tumult subsided." So in the years to follow, there will be prints galore celebrating this sort of coming together of Voltaire and Franklin. Rousseau also gets in on the act, so very often there are prints that celebrate Voltaire, as you see on the left, Rousseau in the middle, Franklin on the right. There are many, many prints of this sort that circulate in Europe, and I think in America too. This is a good example one. The title at the top there says Le flambeau de l'univers, the torch of the universe. So the idea is that these three men are lighting the path of reason in their wish to abolish obscurantism. So it's an example of the Enlightenment fight continuing on both sides of the Atlantic. Now this image is hugely circulated. It's circulated as a print. It's also circulated on snuff boxes, and there are lots of these snuff boxes. I'd love to find one day. And we may think it's a bit demeaning to be on a snuff box, but I think if you have to compare being on Jefferson's inkwell or a snuff box, I think it's better to be on the snuff box. So after 250 years, we're celebrating the enduring importance of the values of human freedom. But we also have to remember that these prints and snuff boxes are part of a huge publicity machine that dealt with celebrity. They're part of a commodity culture where people want to be part of these great thinkers by owning snuff boxes, for example. I'd like to make one last point as I come to conclude. Sometimes when we think about the Enlightenment, people think of the term Enlightenment as though it were some rather sort of celebratory term that celebrates a grand, stable, serene state of affairs. It's not true. The word, first of all, is essentially coined from the 19th century onwards in most European languages. So Aufklärung is a coinage in German, as of course it's famously used by Kant, was ist Aufklärung, in the late 18th century. The question then in France, Italy, Spain, Russia, was to say, how do we translate Aufklärung into our own other languages? And that only happens in the course of the 19th century as we work out Enlightenment, or the French say les Lumières, or las luces in Spanish, and Illuminismo, or Illumi in Italian, and so on. But what I've noticed is that every time that we reach for the term Enlightenment, it's not because we're overwhelmed by the serenity of the Enlightenment values, it's because we think those values are under threat. Cassirer, the great German philosopher, writes Die Philosophie der Aufklärung, Philosophy of the Enlightenment, in 1932, the year before Hitler was elected. Paul Hazard, the great Enlightenment French philosopher, member of the Académie Française, talks a lot about the 18th century, but he doesn't use the phrase Lumière. He only coins Lumière just before his death, when he's in Paris, being effectively hunted by the Nazis. He's living in the Nazi-occupied Paris and feels that his life's under threat. And he uses it in his last work just before he dies. We come back to the term of the Enlightenment always when we think these values are under threat. The great thinkers of the 18th century that I've been referring to are all great campaigners for their ideas. They never took those ideas for granted. They don't celebrate them, they campaign for them. So when we celebrate ideas of the Enlightenment after 250 years, I think what we're doing is not just thinking of the ideas, but we're remembering how we have to go on fighting for them, just as Voltaire and Raynal and Fillinger and all the others did. Last image. Voltaire and Franklin were great celebrities. They were possibly the two great celebrities of their day. and they were hugely adept at promoting themselves as part of their promotion of Enlightenment values. I mean, the two went together. After the meeting at the Academy of Sciences, they met again when Franklin took Voltaire to become a Freemason in Paris. I was learning about that just earlier. We might come back to that afterwards. And the final meeting, as far as we can tell, is when Franklin takes his grandson to visit Voltaire in his house. It's a matter of almost days before Voltaire dies. So this is one of the images of Franklin, characteristic pose, taking his grandson to meet the dying Voltaire, who looks in pretty good form in this picture, but still. The theory was that this was a private meeting. And of course, it was nothing of the sort. This becomes a public event. Both men ensured that their meeting was reported in the press in every last detail. So we know exactly what happened, and I think there were people watching. And as you can see here, this touching encounter between Voltaire and Franklin was hugely and frequently illustrated. So Voltaire takes the young man towards him. As you can see in this gesture, he's in a rather religious manner is putting his hand on the boy's head. And Voltaire, so the newspapers reported, uttered these great words, Dieu et la liberté, God and freedom. This was thought to be unbelievably remarkable by the press of the time. And of course, they're incredibly stirring words. And if you think about it, they mean absolutely nothing. But in a way, that doesn't matter. This phrase, Dieu et la liberté, conveys a sort of intellectual solidarity between the old world and the new, a commonality of shared values, a passion to change society. You promote liberty, which of course is challenging society, but you mention God, which is reassuring. It shows you don't want to upset society too much. So it's a very clever phrase, even though it's meaningless. Voltaire and Franklin were quite simply the two greatest influencers of their age. Their media know-how and their skill in communication is a key part of what we owe 250 years on to the age of Enlightenment. And that's also what we're celebrating. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions. Just raise your hand and Elizabeth will bring it by. But I have a few that were kind of prompted by that wonderful talk. And I learned so much. I wanted to ask just briefly a little bit more about the campaign against serfdom that really was rediscovered, if you will, through your work with the editions. Did you find, when you look at it, that this campaign, which influenced people at the time, it's even on, I didn't realize it was on his, acknowledged in 1779 after he died. And then did biographers mention this in the 19th century? Is it something that was known and then forgotten? Or was it forgotten almost as soon as he died because maybe of the French Revolution and everything else?
Is this what? Yeah. Yes, I mean, it was known in the Revolution, clearly. Mm-hmm. And the Revolution abolishes slavery and abolishes serfdom. So, of course, the two go hand in hand for them. In the 19th century, as a result of the Revolution, Voltaire gets reconfigured as a sort of man of the left. Of course, he was a monarchist, in fact. But in fact, for the 19th century, he represents crudely the left against the right, which is the army, the Catholic Church, and so on. So he's remembered for sort of representing the people. There were a whole string of engravings and paintings of Voltaire talking to peasants. I mean, they're deeply implausible, but they were very much sort of liked, and it was part of his image. So I'm very interested in writing about Voltaire and politics, actually. There's the only good book on Voltaire and politics was by Peter Gay, a great American Enlightenment scholar. And he wrote that book it was his first important book. It goes back to the 50s. And it's a really good book, but he doesn't even mention the campaign against serfdom. And I don't say that to criticize Peter Gay, but just to show how little people were aware of it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Any questions? Jay? We've got people online, if you don't mind. Yeah.
Hello. Did France have a system of indenture or apprenticeship, journeyman, master, as we used to think of in guilds? And if they did have those two related systems, did Voltaire have an opinion on them?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think apprenticeships certainly exist. But the point about the law under the Ancien regime, it was an incredibly messy business. Each of the provinces had a different legal system, so that there were different structures in different cities. It was essentially a medieval structure that had not really been ever rationalized or reformed. And so Voltaire was the campaign to sort of clean up the laws and the campaign to sort of rationalize the legal system becomes a big Enlightenment crusade. In England, it's Blackstone, and in Italy, it was the thinkers of Milan, really, Beccaria, and the Very brothers as well. They were all friends. They were all intellectuals in Milan, thinking about that. So it's so as with serfdom, there wasn't one legal regime, and it varied from town to town, from region to region. There were lots of complicated courts. It was an immensely muddled structure. And it was almost to the point where it almost couldn't be reformed. That was really the crisis of the Ancien regime. And it took the revolution to just try and cut through all that and just start again.
Did Voltaire get word of the Declaration of Independence at that time?
Well, that's a very interesting question. He doesn't, I thought, if you'd asked me this 2 days ago, I'd have said he doesn't really talk about it. I mean, the general view is that, I mean, he's a very old man. By 1777, he's in the last stages of a cancer. He's dying, so he's not probably reading the news with quite the eagerness he would have done when he was 10 years younger. And I thought there was no direct reference to what was happening, though of course he was in touch with Franklin, as we saw. But yesterday when I looked around the library, I found that the library of the APS has 2 letters by Voltaire. One is a letter that has just been left by a donor, and the second is a letter that was in Franklin's papers. And in 1777, so just after the Declaration of Independence, he writes a letter to a French woman writer called Madame du Bocage. She was not a very great writer, but she was a prominent woman playwright. And she was famous for having written a play for the Comédie Française called Les Amazones, the Amazonian Women, which was set in America. Now, this is not the American colonies, this is like Americans as sort of natives. And Voltaire himself had written a very successful play called Alzire ou les Américains, also about American natives. It was a huge success in the 1730s and 40s. So he writes in 1777, many decades later, he writes a very laborious letter to Madame du Bocage, who'd written him some fawning praise of some book he'd written, and says, well, you and I have both written about the Americas. So he flatters her by pretending that their plays were equally important. And there's a wonderful sentence in this letter when he says, vous, madame, les insurgents, me rendez l'Amérique précieuse. So it's you, madame, through your play, and the insurgents, les insurgents, make America precious to me. Now, the original letter has been lost, but she was so pleased with this letter that she copied it out in her own hand and gave it to Franklin. And that object I was looking at yesterday in the library with Dave. So there is a comment on the revolution that I didn't know about. I think you may have to add it to your exhibition.
And I was just going to ask you, are you going to add that to the complete works?
I think the letters in the complete works. But I think we need to add a photograph and a bit more explanation.
I support that completely.
Because in the normal way that editors do things in a rather dry way, Millie says in the American Philosophical Society collection, but I think we need to add that it was a gift of Franklin, right, and it was in the Franklin papers, because that totally changes the way in which we read it.
Yeah. Question? Yep.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. I'm going to ask a somewhat philosophical question. So you mentioned that Voltaire's views on equality, freedom, and race are somewhat muddled, but I felt like I didn't hear a whole lot about the muddle. And so I guess I'm wondering, do you think that some of these biases influenced what he had to say about Enlightenment ideals? Are there ways that maybe our ideals today have evolved or maybe even aren't shared? Or do you think that they were kind of distinct? domains of inquiry.
Yeah, the reason I passed over it quickly is because it's so complicated. I mean, the question comes down to, our modern ideas about race are essentially created in the 18th century. And it all happens at the time of really empire building and so on. So the two things are complicated. And there are broadly two views. There is the view that all human beings descend from one principal pair. We all descend from Adam and Eve. So that's the view that we have in the Bible. So it's strongly the view of the Christian church. There were other views. There were travelers who went to other continents, who found human beings who were different shape, different skin color, different hair. And they said, well, maybe we don't all descend from one couple. Maybe there are different races. I have to be very careful how I use this word, but different types of human being who evolved in parallel and came together. And that was called polygenesis, the view that there wasn't just one thing. Now, when you go into the 19th century, polygenesis becomes, as in the modern sense of the term racist, it becomes a code word for saying that some races are superior to others. And of course, that's something that we hate, and that leads into all sorts of modern racism. I don't think in the 18th century, at the beginning of this debate, it necessarily has that connotation. I mean, it could do, but it doesn't necessarily. So if you ask us, and the other of them leading Enlightenment thinkers, the two who particularly talk about polygenesis are Voltaire and Hume. So this is it's a problem for Voltaire scholars. It's a huge problem for David Hume scholars. Hume is probably the greatest philosopher ever written in English language, and he's being sort of knocked off his pedestal in Edinburgh and etc. So if you wanted to try to understand why Voltaire and Hume have that view, there is a sort of simple view, which is that they're both quite strongly polemically anti-Christian. And so to defend polygenesis is a way also of attacking Christianity. And I'm sure that's like the key motivation, both for Voltaire and for Hume. But it leads them into muddles because potentially it can lead you to a position that runs contrary to the belief in human equality and liberty. So to answer your question, I think we can look at the thinkers of the 18th century and we can acknowledge where they trip themselves up or they get into contradictory positions. And I think that's probably true of most thinkers in most periods in a way. But to take the next step and to say, therefore, we should not read Voltaire or not read Hume, I think that's a bit extreme. I think that there is a broader canvas in which Voltaire is actually saying important things about liberty. He gets some bits of the picture wrong, but overall, if you look at something like the way he treats serfdom and enslavement across the world, he's extremely robust, probably more robust than any other writer in the period. So I think we can still have heroes, but except that they have flaws. I think is that fair, or am I being?
No, that's very helpful.
Great. Thank you. So I have one last question. Since we're here at the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, that's our official title, Philadelphia. Does Voltaire ever write about Philadelphia?
He does. He writes about it in his first important book, which is Letters on the English, published in London in English in 1733, before it comes out in French in France in 1734. In French, it's called the Lettres philosophiques, but in London, it's called the Letters on the English Nation. And it opens with 4 letters about the Quakers. And there's a big question of why he starts a book on the English. I should have explained Voltaire lived in London between 1726 and 1728. So it's a direct result of having lived for 2 years in London. And he learnt, it's important for his cultural development later, he learns English. I mean, he's fluent. He can read English fluently. So that's terribly important for his intellectual horizons later. But he opens his book with the Quakers. So that is a bit extraordinary. Why? Well, it's an easy way into the subject. He makes fun of them while actually admiring their values and their principles. And in letter 4, he describes William Penn. I don't have the text with me. He describes William Penn, and he describes how Penn gives his name to Pennsylvania. And he says, and Philadelphia is the greatest, most flourishing city on this continent. So he wasn't, exactly. So he wasn't the first person to say it, but he was the first person to say it in a hugely widely reprinted text. Yeah. So in terms of telling the history and the contribution of the Quakers, he plays a key role.
Now, do you have any idea where he got that information? Just the circles he was running in London, talking about
Yeah,
Philadelphia in that way?
the
or-
English had written a lot about the history of the Quakers because they were sort of mocked, but they were also vastly admired, of course. And the Quakers, who of course founded Pennsylvania, were also key in English culture, of course, for starting the campaign against slavery. They played a very key role so they were always a rather remarkable thread through Enlightenment thinking. But he read a lot about William Penn in books in English. And the fact he was fluent in English meant that he had access to these texts.
Well, it speaks to the importance of collaboration across borders.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Nicholas, for crossing the Atlantic and joining us. And I hope you all will join us in May for our next lecture. Thanks. Thank you.